On April 11, 1961, the trial of Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann began in Jerusalem. 3 days later, in the April 14, 1961 edition of Life magazine, an intriguing and problematic series of photographs appeared. Sometime earlier, the magazine had dispatched an Albanian-American celebrity photographer named Gjon Mili to photograph Eichmann in his prison cell. Incidentally, this did not take place in Jerusalem as one might expect, but instead in the police station in Yagur, a small community about 12 kilometers outside of Haifa, where Eichmann was held for many months prior to the trial. It is hard to imagine such a photo shoot taking place today, although at that moment it's worth noting that Eichmann had suddenly become one of the most recognized, infamous, and reviled men on earth. When Israeli PM David Ben-Gurion announced Eichmann's capture and the Jewish state's intention to place him on trial for his crimes, the world inevitably took notice. Of course, this was not the case prior to the trial, and the majority of people during World War II did not know who Eichmann was. In fact, most people had never heard of him prior to the Mossad agents tracking him down in Argentina and transporting him back to Israel. During the war, Eichmann was not a public figure and was largely unknown outside the circle of men who had conceived the Holocaust at Wannsee in 1942 and the other bureaucrats in the Foreign Office and other departments who had some responsibility for deportations, forced labor, and Jewish affairs for the SS. It was only at the Nuremberg trials that the general public in America and elsewhere became acquainted with Eichmann's name, since various Nazis, including Dieter Wislicenny, his deputy, mentioned Eichmann while trying to absolve themselves of blame. Years before Eichmann's capture, the majority of the main Nazi leaders had either killed themselves like Himmler or been executed at the conclusion of the Nuremberg trials, or were still languishing in places like Spandau prison. In any event, such a photo spread in Life would, by its very nature, be fraught, sort of like having Annie Leibovitz or Richard Avedon photographing a nefarious terrorist. But somehow the world then, and the publishers of Life, did not really see anything too shocking about sending their celebrity photographer, Mili, to the Yagur police station. This odd working collaboration of a photojournalist and a Nazi perpetrator, although hard to fathom now, somehow produced a series of provocative photographs which present Eichmann in a truly unfamiliar light. Even today, we anticipate that a villain will be presented as a villain. Here's how Time magazine, for example, presented Zarqawi, bin Laden, and Saddam Hussein on their covers. It is fair to say that this villainous aspect is entirely lacking in Mili's police station photographs. Eichmann is presented as exceptionally bland, ordinary, like any other middle-aged man going about his business, perhaps terrified considering what was likely to befall him in the very near future. The question I think is important here is why Mili decided to photograph the SS-Obersturmbannführer in this way and what it ultimately meant. I will tackle this by looking at what it was that Mili produced in that photo shoot from so long ago. And one last thing. It's clear that Mili knew exactly who Eichmann was because, frankly, it would have been kind of hard not to know, since Eichmann's anti-Semitic bona fides were presented ad infinitum in the newspapers and popular magazines of the day. He was charged with being the person who effectively coordinated the machinery of mass murder during the Holocaust. Okay, first, like many artists, Gjon Mili had his own approach toward his work, called it a philosophy. He felt that the camera's purpose was to connect viewers with the subject matter and to reveal truth whenever possible. Mili's photos of celebrities, like tennis pro Bobby Riggs or activist actress Jane Fonda, give you a sense of the subject as a person. They seem to instinctively trust that Mr. Mili knows what he's doing and that whatever he is trying to create will work out for the best. In essence, the photos Mili took of Eichmann, for good or ill, were of the individual he encountered at the Yagur police station. Mili probably didn't feel as if he could adopt any other approach to such an assignment. He wanted to be true to his own vision. Mili's photos are designed to make you feel an unusual intimacy with the subject, as though you somehow encountered that person in real life. His achievement with celebrities is quite uncanny, and it's the reason that so much of his work appears inside Life magazine. The police station photos record for posterity the Eichmann of that moment, the prisoner Mili encountered waiting to be tried for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes against the Jewish people. 15 counts in all. It is decidedly not the man who was photographed many years before in all his scary regalia for his official SS photograph. Incidentally, this is the picture through which most people initially became acquainted with Eichmann. As of 1961, it is fair to say that Gjon Mili was a known commodity. His work had been regularly appearing in Life magazine for over 20 years. Here is a cover from 1945 which reads only Carol Lynn by Mili. The effect with Ms. Lynn's skates is called light painting, something Mili returned to many, many times. Clearly the publishers knew within a certain range what they were sending Mili to do, or at least what he was liable to produce. They were comfortable with this approach and trusted that he would put together something memorable for the magazine. Typically, in portraiture, Mili would strip away anything he felt was artifice, something false, and focus on whatever it was that most struck him as a person's essence. Thus he liked to capture people doing things for which they were best known. He photographed President Truman in the Oval Office because people tend to think of the president sitting behind the resolute desk making tough decisions. With Gene Kelly, he chose to show Mr. Kelly hanging in the air, a moment of dance and pure joy suspended in time. With Carl Hubble and Sammy Davis Jr., he used the stroboscopic effect to show them dancing and throwing, and he did the same with violinist Isaac Stern. This is a picture of a ballerina photographed using the stroboscopic effect. For some reason, Mili seemed particularly interested in Eichmann's hands. Here we see that they are surprisingly well manicured and seem to project power. Remarking upon this strength to Eichmann, Mili reports that the prisoner rejoined with pride that, quote, he had played the violin as a child, unquote. Something about this exchange between photographer and subject was equally disturbing to Mili. In his book, Mili reports emerging from Eichmann's cell, quote, as yellow as wax, unquote. It is possible that Mili could not escape thinking about the hands he had just photographed, which were the very ones that had signed the orders to deport millions of innocent men, women, and children to their deaths in the concentration camps. In a sense, every image that Mili captures is pregnant with contradictions of this sort, the inherent inscrutability of the subject matter. At the end of the day, Mili's job was to make his work stand out, and the easiest way to do this may have been to produce work that would run counter to what was emerging then as the predominant narrative, and for once the public, more than the media, was driving opinion. Eichmann quickly emerged as a kind of monstrous figure, a man who had no conscience about attempting to murder all the Jews of Europe. He had then run away to Argentina rather than face the music with the other Nazis at Nuremberg. He was a coward and a war criminal who was largely oblivious to the extent of his own crimes. In other words, he was kind of beyond the traditional system of justice in any nation. The incredible length and breadth of his crimes generally, rather than any one thing he did or said in particular, was what would convict him ultimately, though it's pretty clear that the Sassen interviews of 1957 probably didn't help matters too much. From Sassen, a Dutch collaborator who conducted a series of long-form interviews with Eichmann, we know that Eichmann still admired Hitler and still identified with Nazism years after the fact, no remorse or regrets. Eichmann's guilt, in some sense, was the kind one never overcomes, no matter how effectively Robert Servatias, his attorney, would perform in the courtroom. Thus, the popular magazines and television programs of the day would tend to demonize Eichmann and convict him before the trial started. Mili clearly wanted to move in a different direction, focusing more on the present-day Eichmann awaiting his day in court, rather than the young Eichmann in his SS uniform, an unrepentant Nazi. In the study of history, it is sometimes tempting to demonize whole groups, as some academics feel that Professor Daniel Goldhagen infamously did in his 1996 book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, with regard to Germans and anti-Semitism. Similarly, if all Nazis are essentially seen as monsters, there is probably not that much that we can learn from the war. The stereotyping of Germans in this manner is no more valid than the crude, farcical Nazi propaganda caricatures of Jews common during and prior to the war. For this reason, Mili portrays Eichmann unadorned, as an essentially harmless older man, fragile and scared, and doing unremarkable things, eating, washing, mopping the floor, writing, otherwise mundane activities. He is like anyone else in these photos, yet this emphasis on ordinariness has a larger meaning. Like others, Eichmann was capable of naive, catastrophic miscalculations, such as hoping that there would never be any day of reckoning for his having participated in the most sadistic genocide in European history, the attempted extermination of an entire race. When Mili photographs Eichmann smoking a cigarette, it is a truly informal, common moment from that time period, especially in Israel, where smoking was nearly ubiquitous. There is indeed a kind of humanization of the Holocaust perpetrator here, pictured doing ordinary things, but in a really different context. Humanizing him shows others that the decisions a man makes in his life have actual consequences. Even if he runs away and hides on a different continent, things catch up to you. Eichmann abetted the cruel and extraordinarily unjust decisions of others, and at that moment, smoking his cigarette in his cell, he must have already realized that he was about to finally face real judgment, and because of television, before the entire planet. In the worst sense of the word, Eichmann was indeed a regular person, flawed, shallow, egomaniacal, vain, plotting, and averse to ever accepting consequences for anything, in denial and unrepentant right up to the moment of his execution. Thus the pictures create a kind of dialogue. It is hard to gaze upon them and not have thoughts about their meaning. There is an inherent conversation implied by anything that Gjon Mili creates. Here, it would seem to be something about the reversals of fortune that men suffer, the inevitable ebb and flow of life, and the inescapable irony of Eichmann finding himself brought before a judicial body, something the Nazis never accorded any Jew in Europe, before deporting him or her to the camps to be humiliated, robbed, exploited, and ultimately murdered. Eichmann had once held the power of life or death over millions of strangers, and he had been merciless in wielding that power. Now he found himself in an Israeli courtroom, trying to explain why he felt it was permissible to abandon all known ideas about morality and human decency in order to exterminate millions of innocent people, and that although he directed much of it, he was not really to blame. He must have known that in that courtroom, a veritable mountain of things he had done and said and signed were now about to come back to haunt him. The interceding 16 years since the end of the war had changed everything. No longer was pseudoscience and Nazism in fashion. By 1961, it was the true-believing Nazi, Eichmann, who was now powerless and subject to the decisions of a three-judge panel interpreting the laws of Israel. The defense of Führerprinzip, that anything Hitler wanted or wished had to be effectuated, was unlikely to convince anyone in Jerusalem. What Eichmann no doubt most feared had now come to pass. His fate would be decided by representatives of the very race which he had unsuccessfully attempted to exterminate. Though much of Mili's work appeared in a weekly magazine, it nevertheless seems clear that he was much more of an artist than a journalist. As a result, his work tended to either capture a moment or communicate a single idea to the viewer. His pictures of Eichmann in the cell seemed to work towards a purpose, to portray Eichmann as sad, lonely, isolated, and old, waiting for many things: judgment in the courtroom, for his food, for his ration of cigarettes, and perhaps also for death. Looking at him on the cot, or pacing wearing his moccasins, or sitting at his little desk, Eichmann seems an exemplar of the wasted life, leaving behind only a name which today lives on in infamy. There seems a message for the viewer. This man could have chosen to do anything meaningful or moral or important with his life, but instead he joined the Nazis and later became a specialist on the Jewish question, and thus an expert on immigration early on after the seizure of power. So you could say an expert on how to effectively rob and exploit the Jews of Austria, essentially financing the Holocaust, and then moving on to the rest of Europe, the same methods of robbing, exploiting, humiliating, and murdering. Eichmann figured out that there could be an economic opportunity to genocide even beyond looting. This is his primary contribution to humanity: opportunism and disingenuousness taken to a level hitherto inconceivable. One day, while looking out the window of my apartment, I noticed an unusual pattern in the snow in the driveway of the house across the street. Sometimes I think back on that moment from around 25 years ago. I'm unsure why I chose to photograph it, but sometimes it feels like a true metaphor for my life, or indeed any life. In regard to the photos, it feels as though Mili might be implicitly raising certain relevant questions. For example, who is this man awaiting trial? Is there anything in Eichmann's face or his demeanor which provides any clue as to why he chose to join up with the National Socialists and expend his life deporting strangers to their deaths? Looking at the photos, it strikes the viewer that Eichmann has to have some kind of motivation beyond a certain tendency toward conformity and his need for acceptance and advancement within the Nazi hierarchy. Indeed, what motivates anyone to expend their life in this manner? Of course, we know that a soldier feels a certain obligation to serve his country, but the horrific nature of life in the concentration camps and ghettos, places he had cause to visit throughout the war, must have made Eichmann especially aware of how far beyond a war against the Jews this had metastasized into. The so-called final solution was effectuated primarily against unarmed and untrained people too weak to even bother defending themselves, often women and children and the elderly. Even in the model ghetto of Theresienstadt, things were far below the basic conditions for the continuation of life. Eichmann visited that particular ghetto many, many times throughout the war. And we know that Eichmann had knowledge of almost every other aspect of what the Nazis were doing in Europe, including the Einsatzgruppen, the Holocaust by bullets, the mobile gas vans, the T4 euthanasia program, murdering the disabled under the guise of mercy, and all the horrific scientific experiments on innocent people in the concentration camps. How did he end up in that cell in Yagur? What motivates a man to become what Eichmann became? A desk-bound murderer with the temerity to then claim he was only another kind of victim of Nazism. In the trial to follow, this was shown to be an unconvincing, even ludicrous defense. Seeing the loneliness and isolation and despair of Eichmann sitting in his cell waiting may be a kind of warning, since the outcome of prejudice and hatred is never something positive. In Eichmann's case, these things lead him to a life on the run, a hunted animal, constantly in fear of survivors seeking revenge, or of foreign agents seeking to try to take him back to answer for his crimes. And his life on the run did not protect him from having to ultimately face the music in Jerusalem. Where did this hatred of others lead him? To a life inside a cell, waiting. Eichmann's story is primarily a cautionary tale. He was so overzealous in his duties, he did not even appear to want to stop and think about the consequences of what he was doing. From all this, it should be clear that people need to stop every now and then and evaluate the wisdom of the direction of their lives, to figure out why they're doing the things that they're doing and whether or not they should continue to do them. In the end, it could be argued that Eichmann's role in trying to exterminate all the Jews of Europe ended up biting him in the ass and eventually killing him just as surely as a lethal disease might have at the end of that noose on June 1st, 1962. The pictures of Eichmann consuming food, and this one in particular, struck me as ironic. While being provided with a proper caloric intake each day, something which never occurred in the concentration camps, Eichmann was being treated with far more deference than any capo or guard ever treated a prisoner in a concentration camp. During Passover, of course, everyone's expected to eat only unleavened bread, or matzah, and Eichmann was no exception. In a recent article, Eichmann's surviving guards were interviewed. They revealed that when he first saw the matzah, he asked, "What is this thing that you give me to eat?" I'm not sure the guards cared, but it's truly remarkable that the Reich's expert on Jewish affairs had never previously seen matzah. This is significant because Passover, or Pesach, is a fairly important festival in Judaism, and matzah is an important part of the Passover Seder, yet Eichmann was oblivious to all of it. Incidentally, the guards said he consumed the matzah without further comment. In the photos, there's a kind of demythologizing of Eichmann. It's hard to see him the same way once you've seen him mopping the floor, pacing in moccasins, eating matzah, hanging up laundry to dry, even sleeping, just like every other prisoner in every other prison. In an odd way, the Eichmann in the pictures matches well with the basic defense he seemed to want to argue before the judges, that he somehow had no agency during the war, and in this way he was like any other victim of the Nazis. Of course, the exact opposite was actually true. His choices, the suffering and displacement he caused millions of other people, that is what brought about his rendezvous with the hangman. He absolutely had a say in things, unlike his victims, and he still chose to assist in effectuating the Holocaust. He had fled to Argentina precisely because he realized that some court somewhere would now see him as deserving punishment for his choices. The powerless Eichmann is the man sitting in the Yagur cell, and also the man in the glass booth in Jerusalem, but it's definitely not this guy, nor the man on the left in this photograph, a young Eichmann harassing an Orthodox Jew, the traditional Nazi bullying photo, to show their dominance over those who are both weak and defenseless. Above all, one could describe Mili's photographs as indelible. The pictures from Yagur are at least as distinctive and as consequential as the trial photos. Their informality, however, can be deceiving. In a sense, all photos are posed, of course. The glass booth creates a series of feelings in the viewer which focus intently on Eichmann as the central protagonist in the trial. Watching the trial, the focus is always on Eichmann and no one else. The survivors have fascinating insights, like this gentleman, Leslie Gordon, though the court kind of admonishes him for his sarcastic tone.
And then you saw this man who was sitting here?
Yes, sir.
Did he look? Then, as he looks now?
האם נראו פניו אז כשנראים הם כיום?
No, he looks much better than he should look. I reckon.
No, please,
לא,
Mr.
הוא
Gordon.
נראה הרבה יותר מדי טוב עכשיו.
No, I'm asking you a factual question. Please answer that.
לא, אני שואל אותך שאלה עובדתית, אנא ענה.
I'm sorry.
אני מתנצל.
Did you understand the question?
Yes, sir.
Then reply to it, please.
Yes, I recognize the man.
האם הבנת את השאלה? כן,
Did he
אז ענה
then
עליה.
look
אני
as he looks now?
No, he was in uniform. He was perhaps younger, with 15, 16 years, but he's...
Somehow, everything always comes back to the man sitting inside the glass box. People remember the judges and the lawyers, Gideon Hausner and Robert Servatias, but in the end, only Eichmann is in any peril. His neck is the only one on the line. Everything else is just a backdrop, and the audience does create a sense of dramaturgy as the viewer becomes aware that the trial is a staged spectacle. The Mili photos are different, but draw the viewer in, promising a kind of intimacy with Eichmann that only a truly gifted artist like Mili could create. The thought occurs that there may be yet another reason that Mili may have taken the photos in this way. He may have been seeking to tell a more universal story through very distinctive images. In a sense, all criminals alone in a cell are kind of the same, and Eichmann is no different, sad, lonely, desperate, afraid, and helpless. Whether he lives another day or gets another meal is no longer up to him. Just as surely as Eichmann himself once determined the fate of those under the jurisdiction of the Reich Central Office for Jewish Immigration and Relocation in Berlin, now his destiny lay in the hands of 3 Jewish judges, Judge Halevi, Judge Landau, and Judge Rave. The criticism today, predictably, is that Mili's photographs may have helped humanize the monstrous Eichmann. They probably do at least a little, but the question is really whether anything, much less some photos, could ever redeem a man like Eichmann. Doubtful, and Mili probably knew this, so he had a bit of leeway. The omnipresent fear is that humanizing such a remorseless criminal as Eichmann, who abetted genocide on such a huge scale, makes us aware that we all have within us the capacity for evil. But this is a slippery slope. The trial in the Bet Hayam courtroom in Jerusalem was about Eichmann's crimes, not humanity's collective weaknesses. Eichmann utilized the rat line to scurry away to Argentina because he knew what he had done wasn't just wrong, but indefensible on every level. It is an unconvincing argument that everyone is guilty, thus no one is ever really responsible for anything, that human limitations are ultimately to blame for the Holocaust. The Mili photos are particularly instructive here, insofar as they show us that one of the main coordinators of these atrocities was just a middle-aged, chain-smoking bureaucrat, nothing remarkable. Men like Eichmann committed monstrous crimes against all humanity, yes, but in the end we can learn from the Holocaust precisely because it was humans, not monsters, who conceived, organized, and then carried it out. It doesn't take much imagination to see how a man may go from here to here, the Reich Security main office, to here, and finally here. In the end, people have choices, and no one forced Eichmann to become a coordinator of mass murder. He chose this destiny, which led directly to the gallows. So there you have it, my take on why Gjon Mili may have photographed Eichmann in the curious and unexpectedly informal way he decided upon in 1961. I hope you found this useful and thought-provoking. Your continued interest in my channel is gratifying. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. I would be grateful if you would hit subscribe. Thank you for watching this video, and I appreciate your interest and time.